This is the Erasing Shame Podcast, Season 5. Diverse perspectives discussing what matters.
Welcome to the Erasing Shame Podcast, Season 5. Diverse perspectives discussing what matters. And on today's episode, given that it's May, both AAPI Heritage Appreciation Month and Mental Health Awareness Month, we will be discussing as a panel our personal experiences around journeys of being AAPI individuals, as well as our experiences in our personal pursuit of mental health and how those two areas intersect. My name is George Xiong, and I'm joined by my lovely co-hosts, Leah Abraham and Hannah Lee Sandoval. And given today's conversation and just the sensitivity of it, we do want to provide a little bit of a trigger warning that as we process through our experiences, we want to be aware that many of our listeners have some of their own traumas that they may still be processing through or that they haven't processed through yet. And this episode may bring up some things for you. But we want you to be aware just so that if you do need to skip out on this episode, feel free to. But as you process through with us, we do hope that this can provide some insight into your own experiences as well. And at the end of the episode, we'll make sure to help guide you and lead you into any next steps that you might need to take to continue to pursue your own mental health and caring for it. But welcome to Erasing Shame. So today, with this conversation, we kind of want to just to work through what it's been like for us as Asian American individuals and just looking at our mental health. And I think it really helps to kind of just start with who we are as individuals and what our story kind of looks like. And so maybe we don't need to go like way back to the beginning of our lives, but can we kind of talk a little bit about what growing up as an Asian American in our communities was like, and what were some of those experiences that you felt like were really shaping your identity and shaping how you saw the world?
Does anyone want to go first?
Do you want to go first, Hannah?
I was like, yeah, I'll bite the bullet. So I shared in another earlier episode that I grew up kind of in a very like Monday through Friday going to a largely Caucasian middle class Christian school, and then Friday through Sunday being around other Korean immigrant families and Korean Americans through church. And that made it difficult, actually, initially, to have maybe a coherent sense of identity because I had to constantly code switch. And so Monday through Friday, I had to be somebody, where I felt this pressure to be somebody a certain way to survive. And, I was one of the few Asians in my class wherever I went, and trying to figure out who I was in a majority white context. And quite conservative and, evangelical Christian. And then on the weekends, I was still at church for the most part, but surrounded by Korean American kids who were very different from me for the most part. And so it was this like constant sense of anxiety and shame and insecurity that I felt like I was having to like constantly ride the waves of that. And then later on, I learned about the concept of code switching, and I was like, oh, so I'm not being like a two-faced hypocrite and wearing masks and just faking to everybody. Because, by the time you're in like your teen years, most young people are really self-aware and very painfully self-conscious already. But it was like the set of rules kept changing wherever I went, and it was just tiring to keep up with. So I think by the time I was in college, I was just like, I'm kind of done having so many different selves because it was just crazy making. And now I kind of just feel like I'm this crazy person. I don't really know who I am. But that's when I was introduced to therapy, and completely changed my journey. And then studying Asian American studies as a major and learning history and having worlds opened up to me that introduced the concept of Asian American for the first time as well. That was all happening for me in my like late teens, early 20s. But yeah, it's been a very like up and down roller coaster of a journey, very, very stressful. But I'm so grateful for the places I've been and the people I've met along the way that have helped shape who I am. But it's not been easy for sure.
And I really appreciate you sharing that. For our listeners, can you explain a little bit more what code switching is and how that?
The worst person. How can I define that? Yeah. I mean, just this idea of like, you need to act one way in one setting with one group of people, and then you have to switch, right? Like the code or the rule book, the unspoken social norms and expectations, right? So then, for example, from even my intonation and the way I like physically carried myself, my Korean friends would say, sometimes you act and look so white. And I didn't know what that meant. But they would be like, no, like you literally pronounce your words differently and you carry your physical self smaller. You take up less space. And then you seem really hesitant to speak up. And then when I was around non-Asian or non-Korean, then they'd be like, oh, you're so outspoken for an Asian. I got like opposite feedback. So just realizing, okay, so this idea of code switching of there's no one normal way to be, but the norms or the bar keeps changing wherever you are, and you kind of have to like adjust to fit in. But it's okay and it's appropriate to do so. Like we wouldn't act the same way at a funeral as we would at a bar, right? Because the expectations and what's happening is different. So it's sort of that idea. That's how I understand it. If anybody else wants to speak into it.
Yeah, I think that was great. I think for myself, there was this process in which growing up, Hmong people are a Southeast Asian refugee immigrant group. And so we had fought in what is known now as the Secret War, which in many, senses continues to perpetuate trauma that we can't really process through or talk about because the name of the war was the Secret War. So who's going to know about it, and what are they going to care about it? But in the process of being torn from our homelands and then placed in America, my family ended up in Minnesota, as did many Hmong families. And the question is, why would you go from Thailand and Laos to the frozen tundra? Well, we don't know. We didn't get to choose. That's where the church families chose to sponsor us from. So we ended up in the frozen tundra around tons of Norwegians and Swedes and but there's this experience as a Hmong person where we feared assimilation so much. And the first gen feared assimilation so much, and so it's not as clean as I think other Asian immigrating situations, right? Where you're coming here for the American dream, and families already have certain jobs that they're looking for when they're coming to the States and immigrating, right? For us, we were very agricultural. Many of the jobs that are offered to these refugee groups are blue collar, right? And factories, whatnot. And so I think what I struggled with growing up in being Asian American was I had to really wrestle through the intergenerational changes of not being able to be Hmong at school, but also having parents who were good enough at English that they were able to just speak with us in English at home as well. And so it was like it was almost like a third culture kid experience for me. And for those of you guys who are listening who don't know what third culture kids are, they're essentially individuals who have a home cultural experience but are implanted into a completely separate cultural experience, and they then end up living in an in-between space of having to experience both of those cultures while feeling like an outsider all the time from both cultures. So that's kind of what my experience was like. And there's so much more tied to, as well as like my church experience and how my non-Christian friends viewed me growing up, because I was throwing away our traditional religion and taking up a white person's religion. And so I was becoming less and less Hmong through my faith and a number of those other stories. But yeah, just a quick snippet tangent. But that code switching is really intriguing to me as far as what my personal experience was like trying to navigate these spaces.
Wow, thanks for sharing that. For me, I don't have necessarily the stereotypical story as an Indian American. I was born in the States, I grew up in India. We moved because my parents wanted my brother and I, growing up, knowing our heritage and our culture and our language. And then I ended up moving back to the States when I was 13 years old. And so the identity crisis of it all was very, like, I used to have my normal preteen angst of like, who am I when I was in India, which is like, I would say fairly, it's what you'd expect, really. But I think the identity crisis really, I think, switched gears when I moved to the States because I didn't really fit in with the Indian American group kids in the States because their experience of being third culture kids. And I was like, I didn't just fit there, so it was really, it took me, I think belonging was a huge thing. But I think a lot of the stereotypes Indian kids get in terms of identity, like your worth is based on your performance. Your worth is based on if you are able to excel in school and be competitive. And what I'm learning and unearthing these days is that a lot of that is tied back to a lot of our generations before, our parents and grandparents still came out where just survival was huge, right? That survival mentality of, do we have enough for the next generation? And then each generation as it passes, it's not only that you are making enough to survive, but you're making enough so you will never know the hunger our forefathers of faith. And so, which comes out, like, it's a very weird mentality that keeps being pushed on generation after generation that I think I think it really affects people's mental health and the way they see and view life and think about wholeness. And so I definitely, I'm now in, like, I'm 27 and I'm finally asking the question of like, well, do I have a learning disability that I never knew of? Because I remember trying really hard to get the best grades as I could, but just not making the best grades. And it wasn't because I wasn't trying, but the feedback I'd get from either family or like my teachers was that, like, we see your potential and you're just not living up to it. And so growing up and just education was really hard because I loved learning, but I wasn't performing well. And so it was like school spaces stress me out now because the whole narrative of like, oh, you're not good enough. You're not enough, like keeps replaying for me. But now that of the work that I'm doing right now of trying to figure out just why am I the way I am, but also like, where do I come from and why is my people the way they are? I'm beginning to like make those connections of like, oh, this is what, oh no, this is why we do that thing. And so I think like my identity journey, I think, is still being formed in that sense. And I'm still in that journey of connecting those dots and naming those things I've been trying to figure out all my life.
Yeah. That's so powerful. And Leah, I'm right there with you. I don't think our identities are static, right? Like we can have these complex identities, and sometimes I feel like once we figure one thing out, something else has been brewing and developing, and it's this constant process of kind of checking in and to be like, well, who am I today? It's different from last week or last month or last year. Like the pandemic, in the past year, everybody has become a different person, you know? And so this idea of identity is often, it feels elusive, right? Like, oh, I want to have a solid sense of identity. Well, for some people that may never come because it's more about the process of becoming, right? Kind of like about, rather than being woke, we are awakening or waking. I feel like identity, I feel more comfortable when I look at my process. It's like, this is a lifelong process. And maybe I would actually need to be concerned if I figured out everything about who I was. And I was like, I'm good. No more therapy ever again. I'm very comfortable with who I am. I like to see it as, you know, I'm a living organism. You know, I'm always changing. So I hope that my identity will continue to grow. So yeah, you're not alone in that sense of I'm still figuring it out.
Yeah. And Leah, I'm so sorry to hear, you know, your experience of having that horrible, you know, just feeling of I'm not enough because I'm not performing in school, right? And you know, our society like puts such a big emphasis on that. And the frustrating thing is, until we become adults and recognize how messed up the system is, right? Our childhood identities are just shaped by these very white normative, you know, proper status quo types of behaviors that we have to, you know, exude. And if we're not meeting those standards, then apparently we're not right and we're not fit for society or fit for, you know, the top of the class. And it's so wrong. And, you know, I think I have a very similar experience of not finding out that I had ADHD until I was 26. And like, you know, for, you know, a Hmong student growing up, like the assumption is because we're refugees or because we're immigrants, because we're foreigners, our learning issues aren't mental health issues, but they're language issues, right? Or they're cultural issues. It's not a mental health space. It's, oh, they're new, they don't get it. And I wonder how much of that played into, you know, my struggles, even though I spoke perfect English, even though I, you know, was able to do well in school. A number of the behaviors that, you know, should have been caught and you know, tested weren't, right? And I wonder, you know, whether or not my ethnicity played a role in that, right? But also because there's less desire to seek those things out in our communities as well, right? It makes it so much more difficult for us to even, you know, question whether or not learning disabilities or, you know, mental health issues are a reason why a person isn't performing well or to their full potential, right? But I'm glad that our worth isn't just found in academics. Being a B honor roll student most of my life, like always wanting to get into the A honor roll, but like never getting there. I think I made it once, but I came to accept my identity as a B plus student. So, but yeah, thank you for sharing your experience in that. And you know, Hannah, as far as connecting with our identities being ever shifting, right? For me, a big part of my understanding of identity formation is that our identities aren't developed in isolation, but they're developed in community, right?
Yeah.
And so much of our identity is formed and shaped not just by our personal passions and desires, but by the needs of our community around us. And so the ways in which we are encouraged, the ways we're affirmed in our gifts and our skills, the ways that we're lifted up, even in our weaknesses, right? Those are the moments in which our identities are really shaped and formed. And the reality is we move a lot, we move often, and our communities change and shift. And I think that's also a big part in why we haven't made it, right? Because our stories aren't complete and we don't stick in one community for our entire lives. So
Yeah. You know what suddenly came to mind? I think it was the Amish community. They like, when their young ones grow up to be like 18 or something, they let them out into the world to live like normal life with technology for a year, and then they get to decide if they'll come back to their home and their community and live like that lifestyle, or if they'll be out there. I think there was a book called Little Black Dress or something I read years ago about that. So I remember when I was reading, I was like, dude, why don't Asians do that? Because in college, I was amazed at how many, and I met mostly, East Asian, Southeast Asian, some, Pacific Islander friends, but a lot of us had sort of had this break from our immigrant communities as we finally were beginning to like individuate or find the individual identity, where we were like, oh my gosh, I might have values and goals that are very different and maybe not like approved of by my community that I come from, but I am seeking and building a community around those values, right? And so I met so many Korean girls in particular, and this was kind of like in the party scene, in college, but like we'd be at like bars or parties or house parties, and it'd be like, oh, all of us were dating non-Korean guys and non-Asian guys. And it was a big part of our identity, though. It was like, no, I'm not about that. Like Asian guys are like brothers, I'm more independent and free spirited. And if I were to be with an Asian guy, then the expectations from my community, that would all come up. Like it was just too much baggage for them. So I always thought, it would be so neat if API families actually had this moment of, like kind of like a rite of passage at some point to be like, so who do you want to be? Who are you feeling called to be as you grow older? What are your goals and dreams? And does it look very different from ours? But no, like, doctor, businesswoman, man, lawyer, right? If you're from an evangelical community, pastor is acceptable, missionary, but we'll worry about you because you'll be poor the rest of your life. Right. And if you're a girl, it's like, oh, please don't become a pastor's wife because you're going to suffer the rest of your life. And so if you like come out of that, it's like, oh, I'm really, really worried about my child. And Leah, you kind of referenced it, this idea of maybe security. I felt like that was a big, maybe unspoken word, but that's what came to mind. Because for Koreans, success and security are actually like, together. This concept of anjang, and it involves marital status, education achievement, certain financial stability. And it's sort of this idea of like, you're not even an adult until you have all this stuff settled, so that now parents don't have to worry about you. You can take care of yourself. And suddenly the roles reverse, and they're like, well, now you pay my bills and you take care of me. And it's just kind of like, well, at what point do I just get to be like me, right? So a lot of the work with my clients, who are largely, Asian American, Pacific Islander women, and, mostly cisgender, it's a lot of struggling with identity because it's so painful to pull away from the expectations and approval of our families of origin, our churches, and to say like no to mom and dad or whoever brought us up, or to leave our churches that we grew up in, to move away. It literally, it's not even just cutting apron strings, it's like cutting an umbilical cord that has a lot of nerves attached to it. And the presence of trauma, right? Or poverty, sort of generations of poverty, generations of survival, that complicates it. And I'm going to finish with this. I know I'm talking a lot here. But I also got diagnosed with ADHD in college my first year, and it was just so clarifying and freeing for me. My parents had a very different reaction to it. And it was like, don't put a label on your area of growth, please. Like, we don't want to recognize this weakness or disorder is like a real thing that there's medication for. Like, why would you see yourself so negatively and give yourself a pronouncement? And I was like, no, this removes shame for me, because number one, I'm not weird, or I'm not a failure. There's other people like me, and two, there's treatment options. I could do something about it. Like, I wouldn't have finished any of my educational degrees without lots and lots of help from therapists and medication, right? But now, kind of, having pulled back, I'm not on medication currently because I'm not in school. And I'm working with clients who are working through, do I have a learning disability as an adult, getting diagnosed? It's like, well, is it trauma or is it ADHD or is it both?
Wow.
Because trauma does a lot of the same things to the brain that ADHD does, right? So the hypervigilance, where you're really, really sensitive and easily triggered, the lack of executive functioning, trauma brain also looks like that, because the amygdala is almost always on or easily turned on. And so an anxiety, not wanting to focus on one thing, because when you have trauma in your body, it's hard to sit still with that feeling. And so it's a lot easier to just constantly keep moving from one thing to another. And so I'm like, hey, it's probably both. And if we normalize that, and if we don't even call ADHD a learning disability, but we look at it as just like not being neurotypical or being neurodivergent, and we can be culturally sensitive and trauma informed about it, can it actually be something that we approach with so much empathy and grace and empowerment? Because I think there's gifts that come with having a learning disability or being differently abled. So that's my long spiel.
Boom.
Wow.
See you next episode. Just kidding.
Yeah, we're just going to chew on that for
a good day or two at this point.
So one thing, actually, obviously respond how you want to, but I would love to hear at some point what we love about being API, what we celebrate, the best parts of being who we are, even though it's not been easy. And what's been a gift to you or a blessing along the way.
So I'll go. Well, first, like Hannah, when you were talking about the idea of giving this rite of passage or this ability to choose for yourself, created a lot of tension in me. Okay, like I was like, "Whoa, Hannah, slow down here. We don't push these boundaries." But I think there's a huge need for kind of this idea of communitas, and the last podcast that I was a part of, we actually talked about this experience of stepping out of our Hmong community and context in order to go and learn new ways of doing things in order to bring it back to the community and grow the community. And this is how, communities grew. When we're talking about, prior to, all this technology and information being at our fingertips, like communities had to send out individuals to go and learn from the rest of the world in order to bring those things back and for that community to grow in those experiences. So I think that is definitely something that we have to, really consider as AAPI. What does it look like for us to kind of leave our original context in order to grow, but also in order to help our communities grow when we return, if we ever do. But in addition to that, I think the thing that I love the most about Hmong culture is our food. And I say that very biasly. But the reason why I love our food so much is because not just the food itself is amazing, but the way that we do food and do meals is really, really communal and very, very like everybody's hands-on, everybody's a part of putting the meal together. There are some patriarchal pieces to mealtime that I don't enjoy so much, but there are definitely pieces to how we do food that just really makes it like this is community. This is us all eating at once. This is us in this space working together to feed each other. And my dad used to. So this is my dad in his orphan mentality. But he used to teach me and my brothers. There were 9 of us, my brothers and sisters. So 6 boys, 3 girls. And my dad would teach us that if we were ever in a stuck place and all we had was like one piece of meat and a little bit of rice for all of us, that what we need to do is not just cook the meat and try to split it up as evenly as possible, but that it's our duty to find the best way to cook the meat in a way so that everybody can enjoy a full meal. And so you would find a way to boil the meat and shred up the meat and then cook the rice and make it so that everybody was full enough to continue the journey, right? And that's what I think I really enjoy about my culture, is that around the dinner table, around meals and the food, there's a sense of community that really develops. Yeah.
Beautiful.
What's your favorite meal?
Ooh. I'm gonna go with soccer tournament meal. And so Hmong people have a huge soccer tournament that takes place usually on July 4th weekend. But because of the pandemic, it hasn't happened over the past 2 years. It won't happen over the past year. It won't happen this year either. But millions flock to Minnesota and land in St. Paul, and we host this 3-day soccer tournament and other sports tournaments. But at the soccer tournament, you get sticky rice, you get a chicken thigh, some Hmong sausage, papaya salad, and a cup of I guess it's called tricolor in English, but navang, which is like tapioca, coconut milk, and simple syrup. It's a dessert drink, but that
Kinda like
meal
halo
there,
halo?
yeah, kind of like halo halo. It's that meal. That's just like you have everything that you need, and it's like the perfect balance between everything. So if you ever get the chance to go to a soccer tournament or any Hmong tournament around you, go and just
awesome.
order this little platter for yourself.
Where can we find these? Now I really
know. I just had dinner and I'm still hungry now. Oh, that's awesome. George, you stole my answer. I was also going to say food.
Yes. Hey, this is your food podcast now.
Yeah, but I also think one of my favorite parts about Indian culture at its best and at its healthiest, I think your community shows up for you. Whether it is to grieve or to celebrate or just to anything in between, I think they show up for you. I think if there's a death of a loved one, you can be sure that you will have few people coming to your door with like Tupperwares with food. Or if there's something to celebrate, like our WhatsApp group chats just like explode with and I think I think there's at the end of the day we'll be there for you mentality in many communities. I won't say everyone has that privilege, but at its best, I think that hospitality and Yeah, it's reverse. Like I think in the U.S., what I've noticed is that people can be very nice and pleasant and open at like first meeting or first glance or with strangers, but then there's more distance the more you get to know them. But I think it's the opposite, at least in India, or at least where I am from in India, which is the south in the state of Kerala, where like you see people, they're just really suspicious of you. They keep their distance. They're like very like, I don't really know about you or where you're from or what you're about. But if you are invited to their house, right, or if like once you get to know them deeper, just the hospitality and that generosity, that spirit of generosity is very apparent. And yeah, I'm really grateful for that because, for example, like my parents live on the other coast of this country, and they're slowly getting older, and I'm worried, but I'm not too worried because I know they have a really good, strong community around them who will be there for them. And part of that, I think, is also immigrant mentality. But that's sort of, at the end of the day, we will have each other's back. I think that is what they've seen growing up in India as well. And so, and that's also expressed through food, right? So like the food that they make for each other and what they use to celebrate and all of that. I think it's all interconnected. And so I really love that part of my culture.
Hey, so this is kind of a little tangent, but I, my friends and I have been praying for India because on the news, the COVID surges. So just wondering how that's sitting with you, Leah.
Yeah. I'm angry. It's just, it's bad, right? And I think the way the government's handled it, and is continuing to handle it's just awful. And I also know that there were elections, like a lot of local elections that were happening. And so I'm convinced that it wasn't like a rapid surge out of nowhere. I think they've been underreporting the numbers, right. And I know there's just a lot more. And so I'm just very pissed off, really. And those are feelings we try to keep bottled in for the most part, because it's one of those, like, I'm helpless for the most part, right? Other than being able to spread awareness and donate and encourage others too, there isn't much I can't be there to ease suffering. And that weighs on me. Thank you for asking, Hannah.
Yeah. I had spent about 6-7 weeks in India years ago. And so when I heard about what's happening, I reached out to some friends in Goa, which is quite different. Their lifestyle there, they're doing okay. But similar sentiment of like anger and frustration with the leadership and the corruption there. And sort of like, they could have prepared better for this. Kind of like many of us felt here and, our previous president. But there's so many more people there and the class differences. And yeah. So, a lot of us have been holding India in prayer and, sending donations to the orgs and people that we know.
Thank you.
Yeah. Actually, when I was on a train I went Goa to Mumbai to Calcutta, and on the way I met these young Indian women who were just so amazing and college educated, spoke English. But one gal and her fiance spoke with me the entire trip, and basically when we got to Calcutta, she invited me to her home. She paid for the taxi fare. Her father cooked like a 4-course meal, and I was like, "Oh, your dad? That's cool." She gave me one of her like bridal outfits, like something she had received, and I was just like, "Oh my God, you're treating me like I'm your best friend in your bridal party." I just met you, like I think 24 hours ago, and you're like bringing me into your home at 11 at night, and I'm a complete stranger. And I was just so moved and touched, and I was just like, you'd never see this in the US. And I really came home to the US realizing I actually felt kind of poor coming to the US, right? This idea of like we got wealth and poverty, like that mentality of what true riches means, so backwards. And I felt safer in India physically, even though I looked like a North Indian. I think people thought I was like, like of that blood. I felt safer there. I could walk up to a complete stranger, and the places I were very like urban, but like an older male and be like, "Uncle, can you help me get to where and where?" You would not do that in the States. I don't know about the Midwest. You definitely don't do that here in LA.
Yeah.
I'm not your uncle.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But that hospitality really, transformed me. I'll just say with Korean culture, something that I've learned to really love is the strength and the fierceness of people. I didn't know until I had studied a lot of immigration history and then focusing on Korean women in church history and missions history and seminary I was studying. I wrote a paper on it. I wept through eraser paper. That had never happened before. But realizing how strong women have been, and it made me look again at what does strength mean. In a Western context, strength can be interpreted a certain way. But what I used to look down on as, oh, I'm so frustrated that Asians are so quiet and just long suffering and they never say anything. And a lot of us grew up with that's just how we are, the model minority, and that's how we have to be. And that did not fit with who I was. But realizing oh no, we just use our strength differently. We're very strategic. We do things together. We know how to suffer and sacrifice and submit, but we also know how to fight back and rebel and organize ourselves and enact change, So yeah, strength is something I love in the Korean culture. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. I feel like we can do a whole nother episode just on processing through, the things that really make us who we are. And, kind of what we were talking about, even just with identity, so much of our identity formation also affects our mental health. And I think early on in our conversation, we hit on a number of issues growing up that really challenged our identity, as well as put us in pretty desperate spaces of mental health. And so I'm just wondering, currently, with where you are at with your personal identity and mental health things that are coming up for you, what is it like maybe looking for support and if you feel comfortable with sharing, what does it look like for you in searching for support, and what is taking care of your mental health looks like, maybe even in your cultural context?
Yeah. Leah?
Go first. I'm really excited about this conversation because I'm brand new to this in many ways. I recently, I had suspicions, but I recently was diagnosed with anxiety and depression. I knew about my depression. I had a feeling, but the anxiety was new, and it actually just made a lot of sense. Last year, I just, in a span of 4 months, I had a series of pretty traumatic events happen back to back, and that just completely affected my mental health. And so it was the first time I got a therapist that sort of helped me identify those things, especially the anxiety part. I didn't realize that a lot of what I was doing and thinking and feeling were actually bad and just symptoms of that something's not right. And so I'm part of me is really excited because it's really helping me connect a lot of dots that I just did not realize needed to be connected, in terms of as I'm working through a lot of childhood stuff as well. And so so now I'm in my journey of trying to find another therapist who's a better fit for me and what I'm looking for, and can help me address the things that I need to be addressed. It is something that I knew, thankfully, that once I found a therapist and once we were being able to identify these things, that I had to start, I just had to tell my trusted people about this. I was like, hey, by the way, I'm going to therapy. She told me that I probably have anxiety and all of this, mostly because I did not want to fall into the trap of having this be a shameful thing and it just being my little secret, like don't tell people that you're affecting, because in my Indian circles, a lot of times mental health and a lot of those things, it can be seen as a weakness, but a defect in your character or your worth or your personhood. There's a lot of shame, and I wanted to dispel that. And so at least to my trusted circles of people and friends, as I just to get in the habit of like just practicing saying those words, so it doesn't feel hard when if and when I do have to have hard conversations. And so yeah, I am it's very new. I'm still learning more about this in myself and how it manifests and how to just the emotional regulation part of all that and everything. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing. Hey, George, I'm going to ask you a question. You don't have to answer, but we're all 2s on the Enneagram. I also have struggled with anxiety, depression, probably since a lot younger than I, care to remember. But I've often wondered if it comes hand in hand with having ADHD as well as being a certain personality type. So, George, do you also have does any of this resonate with you? Because I know for sure ADHD, anxiety, depression, those are like my big 3 that I am constantly managing. Yeah.
I'm definitely a 2, but the 7 in me wants to say no. Like that, I don't struggle with anything. There are no limits, no bounds. Just nope. We're just gonna push through and do what we want to do. Oh goodness, yeah. No, there's so much with anxiety and depression that comes up with, especially the ADHD, and a lot of it comes out of performance-based anxiety. And for an individual who struggles with ADHD, the biggest fear that they often have is fear of rejection or fear of disappointment, right? And now it just sounds like I'm talking about all Asians, but
no, really.
But there's this space in which we fear so much that if we don't have something good to show, that we can't show anything at all. And that's when we fall into our procrastination cycles. That's when we fall into pits of despair and just anxiety around whether or not this is good enough, whether or not it means I'm good enough. God bless my wife. She's walked me through a number of seasons of anxiety and depression and just feeling stuck and as though like, this is never going to happen. I'm never going to be who I need to be. And she's just been there like, you're going to be okay. She's a 6. So she's a great loyalist. And she's just like, no, you need to believe in yourself. You have all the gifts and the tools that you need. And I'm just like, yeah, super thankful to be blessed with such an amazing life. But definitely lots of anxiety and depression as well to have to process through.
Yeah. So I, working with largely API young adults, I feel like it's such a common thing to see intergenerational trauma, anxiety, especially around boundaries and individuating or just trying not to be so enmeshed with the family. And then depression when they do experience that rejection, right? Of like, why did you do this? Why didn't you do this? I disown you, or you're not good enough somehow. That it's almost like when I meet someone who doesn't have anxiety, depression, and trauma, and they're a child of immigrants, I'm like, really? Tell me more. You're a unicorn. I feel like it's just such a common experience for many of us. And, something with especially Korean Americans that I've talked about a lot is actually suicidal ideation. And so we were warning earlier, but, especially with Koreans, like I think South Korea is known for one of the highest suicide rates. And then it's actually with academic performance, Korea and Japan both, right? You get stories of students not passing certain exams to go into college. and then they take their life. And it's just so gut-wrenching and heart-wrenching. And then for us to learn that, right now, right, suicide is the leading cause of death for AAPI young adults. That was like, oh my God, I knew it was up there, but I didn't realize it was like number one, especially because of the pandemic, racial violence. So it's something we talk about a lot to destigmatize, also to normalize, not to say it's like really good or, normal, like easy, but to say like, hey, you're not alone. A lot of us have these thoughts of, I don't want to be alive anymore, or living is too hard, or nobody would care if I just disappeared. Like, those are thoughts that I wish there were more safe spaces where we could just say that we feel that way, and for people to kind of know what we're talking about, but also for there to be people that are like, okay, well, I hear you and you're not alone, but I also want to make sure that when that thought starts to really persist, or when it gets really scary, right, and you're not happy with how often that thought and feeling is there, do you know who you need to call, where to go, right, to find the right steps to get help? Yeah.
And it's so difficult because oftentimes when we're in those spaces, we've already allowed ourselves to become so isolated that it's so difficult to hear other people's voices and find comfort and believe that someone else would even care to look at us, right, or even want to hold us, right, or embrace us in our despair, because we've already rejected ourselves so much, right. And this is, I think, too, the importance of community, and not just any community, but like real, intentional, and intimate community where we're known by people, so that we don't allow ourselves to get so far off in isolation, right? I often tell all of my clients that we weren't meant to do life in isolation. We were meant to do life in relationships, and even though we may be hurt in relationships, that the hope is we're also healed in relationships. And so, as we're talking about how our contexts maybe put certain pressures on us, how we might find ourselves being told by others or telling ourselves that we're not worth it because we're not meeting certain standards that the world places on us, right? That our worth isn't really found in those things, but it's found in who we are, and who the people who love us remind us who we are, right? And so there's a need for that intimate community, but also, like you were saying, Hannah, that when you can't find that there are other resources out there and available for you to be reminded of your humanity, to be reminded of who you are, and what's great about you, and why you need to continue to exist and live out who you're supposed to be.
Yeah. George, I kept waiting for you to actually be like, your value and worth isn't found in this, it's found in Jesus Christ our Lord. Just waiting.
I could go there.
Around it so nicely. No, but really, I think a surprisingly high number of people who have faith, religion, and spirituality still struggle with mental health issues, because even in the church, mental health has been stigmatized. And it's so cool and great to go to your pastor, your priest, whoever it is. But some people just need more, and that's so okay, and medication is okay. And whatever helps you get better and feel better and live a fuller life, right? That needs to be okay. That has to be okay.
Yeah.
Leah, did you have any thoughts?
I'm just writing notes of all the things you guys are saying right now. No, but thank you for the words that you guys are sharing. It's really affirming and healing to hear those things from both of you, on a personal level. So thank you for the wisdom and for creating the spaces for this conversation. I'm curious, for those who might want help but have never reached out before, and might not know where to go, where to start. What would you both recommend? How could they start to look, and what specifically should they be looking for?
George, you have any thoughts?
Yeah, just very quick. If you and your family are privileged to have health insurance, call your health insurance providers and ask them what your behavioral health insurance looks like. And ask them for either a list or access to the portal that would provide you a list of providers within your network. That's the fastest and easiest way to get in with a therapist who you won't have to deal with all the insurance issues around. And hopefully in that space, you can also ask for certain identifiers that you would like your therapist to have, and your portal through your insurance should be able to filter through a lot of those identifiers to find someone specific that you're looking for.
Yeah. I'm going to add, during the pandemic, a lot of people haven't updated that they're not taking new clients. So my supervisor is awesome. She's like, make the insurance people work for the client. So the client is absolutely allowed to say, I only want people who are taking new clients currently that you've verified. As well as, if they've already gotten the list, they're like, oh, they're taking new clients, you call all 5 and they're not, to be like, can you please help me find out exactly who is in my area, meets these qualifications, and they are taking new clients, because I don't have time and energy. I'm not well enough to be calling 20 other people. Like, you need to do the work for me.
Right.
Yeah. For Asian American Pacific Islanders in particular, on Facebook, actually, that's a really great place. There's these spaces that are very mental health destigmatizing. So we specifically come and talk about all things mental health with other Asian American Pacific Islanders. So like Asian Mental Health Collective, therapists and people looking for therapists, and just people talking about things openly gather there. There's, I think, APITA or someone does. There's a couple of Asian American Pacific Islander therapist directories. I know specifically that there's a group of Asian American Christian therapists online, and we'll kind of refer to each other, asking friends who are in therapy, like, hey, do you like your therapist? Could your therapist connect me with one of their friends, or could I see your therapist too? I've totally done that. It's early in my journey. And then Psychology Today. I love Psychology Today. I think it's quick. You can put what kind of therapy you want, the demographics of who they serve. Like if you're a queer Filipina, like you can kind of, mark some of those boxes. If you want to do a certain kind of therapy, YouTube is a great resource as well. But Psychology Today will also help you filter out which insurances they take too.
Yeah.
One more question. How does someone know if they're a good fit with their therapist or counselor?
If they're worth the money you're paying them, girlfriend. I mean, I will say community mental health, like the ones that your insurance, especially if you have like Medi-Cal, might cover, not as maybe like long-term. They do a lot of crisis sort of stuff. But if you're willing to put in an investment of like 100 and up, you can ask for sliding scale if you have a kind of lower income situation. But generally, private pay, private practice therapists, there's a lot of freedom there. But if you're, it's like a car payment, right? You're investing in your mental health for the rest of your life. So, expect anywhere from like a $400 to $700 investment a month. Or you can go biweekly to bring that down a bit. But yeah, if you feel that person is worth it after like 6-7 meetings, if you feel safe, you can say whatever you need to without fear of judgment, but they'll be honest with you and challenge you. And if you feel like you're getting something out of your time and your money, and hopefully a good therapist, if they don't feel like you're a good fit for them as a client, will be upfront with you and be like, I don't want to waste your time and money, but I don't feel like we're progressing towards your goal. Or usually they'll say, do you feel like you're happy with how we're progressing towards your goals, right? But clients are consumers, right? It's your time and money. So shop for the best therapist you can, just like you would for a house or a car. It's a huge investment, but it could be life-changing.
Yeah. Yeah, I ditto that, and it is really a hard space because yes, it looks like a really big investment to be making, but it's you, right? It's your life, it's your ability to enjoy it, right? And it's something that really ought to matter to you. And so, if you find that you aren't a good fit with that counselor, that's totally okay. Let your counselor know, because they're not going to have their feelings hurt. And if they are, they can deal with it with their supervisor. You're looking for someone who's going to be able to understand you and make you feel safe so that you can process through all your work. And so feel free to shop around and allow yourself to really find the right person who's going to help you process through a lot of your work that you need to do. So
yeah. Great questions.
No, these are good feedback, especially as I'm looking for someone who's a good fit for me. I also wish I had heard these words when I was first looking. So this is really valuable information for people. Who might be looking.
Yeah. One other thing that I'm just going to add on really quick, and then we got to wrap it up here, is you may not find the perfect person to be your therapist. So don't go looking for, you might find the perfect person, but don't set your heart on finding the perfect therapist. If it's needed, your therapist will grow with you and will do the work that they need to meet you where you're at. That's really, good. A good worth therapist right there is someone who's willing to do the work that they need to get to where you are. But don't allow that to also be an obstacle for you to say, oh, I'm never going to find the perfect therapist, so there's no point in me looking for therapy. Start somewhere, get some work done, and then you can continue to move.
Kind of like dating, but not. Like, don't expect Mr. or Miss Perfect, but don't also settle for someone you're not happy with.
Absolutely. Well, this was a wonderful conversation, and I'm so thankful to have had it with both of you. And we'll link some of those resources in the show notes, and make sure that if you guys have questions about mental health, how to pursue finding a therapist, or anything else like that, please fill in the comments, send us an email. We want to know how you're processing through these things as well. And we're just really thankful that you're here with us and joining in the discussion. So until our next episode, take care of yourselves, and we'll see you in a few weeks, I guess.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Erasing Shame podcast. Check out our website at erasingshame.com. We would love to hear your comments and questions. Please subscribe on any podcast app like Apple, Google, Spotify, or on Facebook and YouTube. And please add a rating, a review, and a share so more people can experience the freedom and healing that comes from erasing shame.